Number 10. Chiquihuite Cave, the tools that should not exist. High in the mountains of northern Mexico, far above the easy routes of travel, Chiquihuite Cave sits in a place that should have been almost empty of early human life. The cave lies more than 2,700 meters above sea level, in cold, difficult terrain that even modern researchers do not reach casually. It is not a warm shelter beside a river or a simple camp near open grassland. To get there, ancient people would have needed effort, memory, and a reason strong enough to climb into a harsh mountain refuge. That is why the discovery inside became so disturbing. Deep in its sediment layers, archaeologists recovered stone artifacts that appeared to have been deliberately shaped by human hands. And the oldest dates attached to those layers suggested people may have been there around 30,000 years ago. But for most of the last century, the story of the Americas seemed much cleaner. Humans were believed to have arrived relatively late, moving from the north near the end of the last ice age and spreading across the continents after the ice began to open. That timeline left room for debate, but not for people living deep in Mexico, tens of thousands of years earlier. Chiquihuite Cave challenged that structure directly. If the oldest tools and dates truly belong together, then humans reached parts of the Americas far earlier than the standard story allowed, during a world still dominated by ice, cold, and barriers that should have made movement almost impossible. This was not a minor correction to a map. It suggested an earlier chapter of human movement that may have failed before later migration succeeded. The cave is haunting because the tools are present, but the people are not. There are flakes, blades, and worked stones that suggest repeated activity rather than one accidental visit. Yet no skeleton has appeared to give the makers a face. No grave explains who they were. No preserved body tells us whether they looked like later populations, belonged to an early branch of Homo sapiens, or represented a lost human group we barely understand. The cave preserves the evidence of hands, but not the bodies those hands belong to. It gives us labor without identity, survival without a voice, and presence without a clear descendant. That kind of evidence is almost cruel, because it proves enough to disturb the story, but not enough to complete it. That absence may be the darkest part. Modern indigenous populations of the Americas trace their ancestry mainly to later founding groups that expanded after the Ice Age. But if a much earlier population truly used Chiquihuite Cave, then those people seem to have left little or no visible genetic legacy in the present. They were there and then they were gone. An entire human thread may have entered the Americas, survived for generations, adapted to brutal conditions, and vanished before later histories began. Their children may have learned the mountains, shaped tools, followed animals, made fires, and died without passing their line into any living people we can identify. The location makes the mystery harder to dismiss. Why would anyone climb to such a place again and again? The cave offered shelter, but not an easy life. Food, fuel, and water had to be found beyond its mouth. Perhaps it was a refuge during dangerous seasons. Perhaps it was a lookout, a stop along a mountain route, or a place remembered for reasons that were practical, sacred, or both. And whatever drew them there, the people who left those artifacts were not wandering blindly. They knew the landscape well enough to return, and they used the cave long enough for their presence to settle into the ground. The mountain was not empty to them. It had meaning, roots, dangers, and memories that disappeared with the people who knew them. That is why Chiquihuite Cave belongs among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. It does not give us a painted wall, a frozen body, or a dramatic grave. It gives something quieter and more dangerous to the timeline, evidence that someone may have been in the Americas far earlier than expected, and almost no clue about who they were or what became of them. Deep in the Mexican mountains, unknown hands shaped stone in a world before recorded memory. But then those people disappeared so completely that only the cave remained to testify that they had ever existed. And that may be the most disturbing discovery of all. Not that the cave was occupied, but that an entire human beginning could vanish into darkness with nothing left but tools. Number 9. El Sidrón Cave, the Neanderthal family that was eaten in northern Spain, inside a limestone cave system, a discovery first mistaken for a modern crime scene, became something far older and far more disturbing. When human bones were found in El Sidrón Cave, the first assumption was that they might belong to victims from recent history, perhaps people hidden during conflict. But the bones did not come from the modern world. They belonged to Neanderthals, who lived around 49,000 years ago, in a cold and unstable Europe where survival was never guaranteed. As researchers recovered more remains, the cave began to reveal not a random scattering of bones, but part of an extended family group, adults, adolescents, juveniles, and an infant. They had lived together, died together, and then something worse happened to them after death. The marks on the bones are what turned the discovery from tragic to horrifying. Long bones had been broken open to extract marrow. Skulls had been fractured to reach the brain. Cut marks showed where flesh had been removed with stone tools. The patterns were not accidental cracks, animal bites, or damage from the cave. They matched the same kind of butchery used on animal carcasses. Whoever processed these bodies knew exactly where to cut, where to break, and what parts were worth taking. This was not simply violence, it was consumption. The Neanderthal family from El Sidrón had been treated as food. What makes the cave especially unsettling is that the killers were almost certainly Neanderthals too. These were not modern humans attacking a disappearing cousin species from the outside. This was one branch of the Neanderthal world turning on another. But in small Ice Age populations, neighboring groups may have known each other, crossed paths, shared territory, competed for animals, or even exchanged mates. That means the people who butchered this family may not have been total strangers. They may have recognized faces, voices, kinship signs, or group identities before reducing bodies to meat, marrow, and bone fragments. The cave preserves the moment when social boundaries failed and survival, conflict, hunger, or hatred crossed into cannibalism. The reason remains unknown, and every possibility is dark. It may have been starvation during one of the brutal climate swings that struck Ice Age Europe, when animals disappeared from familiar valleys and small groups ran out of options. It may have been territorial violence, a raid between desperate bands competing for shrinking resources. And it may have been revenge, punishment, or some form of ritualized consumption we no longer understand. But the practical nature of the butchery makes the scene difficult to soften. The bodies were processed efficiently, the marrow was taken, the skulls were opened. The dead were not simply buried, displayed, or symbolically marked. They were used. At the same time, El Sidrón forces us to look at Neanderthals without comforting myths in either direction. They were not dumb brutes, but they were not gentle forest philosophers either. They were human relatives living under extreme pressure, capable of care, tool-making, social life, family bonds, and violence. The genetic evidence from the cave suggests relationships among the individuals, turning the remains into something more intimate than a collection of victims. There were siblings, children, and adults who likely shared daily life before the final event. They may have hunted together, sheltered together, protected the young, and carried memory from one generation to the next. Then their group ended, and their bodies were cut apart. That is what makes the discovery so hard to escape. Cannibalism is disturbing enough when imagined in the abstract, but El Sidrón gives it family structure. It gives it ages. It gives it children. It gives it the marks of stone tools on bones that once belonged to people who looked out from cave mouths, made fires, knew danger, and may have felt grief like we do. The infant in the group was not a symbol to them. The adolescents were not specimens. The adults were not fossils. They were members of a small human world, and that world was destroyed so completely that only the butchered remains survived. That is why El Sidrón Cave belongs among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. It does not show us a noble ritual or a beautiful painting. It shows us the edge of survival, where a human family became a resource in the hands of other humans close enough to share their species. The cave held the bones in darkness for nearly 50,000 years, preserving cut marks, fractures, and the silent evidence of a meal no one was meant to remember. When archaeologists opened that chamber, they did not only find Neanderthal remains, they found a warning from deep prehistory. Our extinct cousins were not monsters, but under enough pressure, even people become capable of monstrous things. Number 8. Lagar Velho, the child between two human worlds. In a rock shelter in central Portugal, archaeologists uncovered the grave of a child who seemed to belong to two human stories at once. The site, known as Lagar Velho, held the remains of a young boy who had died around 24,500 years ago, long after Neanderthals were thought to have disappeared from Europe. He was only about 4 years old. His body had been carefully placed in the ground, covered with red ochre, and accompanied by ornaments and animal remains that suggest love, ritual, and a belief that death required preparation. This was not a discarded body. It was a burial. Whoever laid him there took time to position him, mark him, and send him into the earth with objects that mattered. At first, the grave looked like a moving but familiar Ice Age burial. A child had died, and his people had mourned him. But when researchers studied the skeleton more closely, the bones became controversial. Some features looked clearly like Homo sapiens. The chin, teeth, and parts of the skull belonged comfortably within the world of modern humans, but other parts of the body seemed to echo Neanderthal anatomy, especially the strong and shortened limb proportions associated with cold-adapted Neanderthal bodies. The skeleton did not fit neatly into one category. It seemed to carry traces of two human populations that official timelines preferred to keep separate. That is what made the Lagar Velho child so disturbing. If the interpretation was correct, he was not simply a modern human child with unusual proportions. He may have been the descendant of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, a living reminder that the boundary between the two was never as clean as museums and diagrams once suggested. But the timing made the idea even more unsettling. Neanderthals had supposedly vanished thousands of years before this child was born. If his body still carried visible traces of Neanderthal ancestry, then Neanderthal lineages may have continued inside human communities long after the species itself disappeared from the fossil record. The scientific debate became fierce because the child stood at the edge of identity itself. Was he evidence of hybrid populations surviving in Ice Age Iberia? Was he a modern human child whose body had been misread? Did his bones preserve a long genetic echo of Neanderthal ancestry, or were researchers seeing what they expected to find? The arguments matter, but the burial remains powerful no matter which interpretation is true. The people who buried him did not treat him as a specimen between species. They treated him as one of their own. They wrapped him in care, covered him in ochre, and placed meaningful objects beside him. Whatever his ancestry, he belonged to the living community that mourned him. That human detail is what makes the discovery more haunting than the controversy. We often speak of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens as categories, as if prehistoric Europe were a chart of migrations and extinctions. But the Lagar Velho child reminds us that the meeting of human groups was not only competition or replacement. It may also have been intimacy, families, children, shared shelters, mixed ancestry, and people whose bodies carried histories from both sides. The end of the Neanderthals may not have been a clean disappearance. It may have been a slow absorption, generation after generation, until a people vanished as a separate world but survived in fragments inside another. The grave also reveals how deeply Ice Age people understood childhood death. A 4-year-old child does not build monuments, lead hunts, carve weapons, or create political power. Yet this child received ceremony. The red ochre was prepared and placed deliberately. The ornaments had to be chosen. The burial required grief shaped into action. That means his value was not based on achievement. It was based on belonging. And in a harsh prehistoric world where survival demanded constant effort, his community still gave labor to the dead. They still paused to mourn. They still turned loss into ritual. That is one of the most ancient signs of humanity we have. That is why Lagar Velho belongs among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. It does not horrify through violence, cannibalism, or a body trapped in stone. It disturbs us because it blurs the boundary of what we mean by human. The child in the Portuguese rock shelter may have carried the memory of Neanderthals in his bones, while being loved, buried, and mourned by Homo sapiens. He stands at the place where extinction becomes family history. And when we look at him, we are not only looking at a lost child, we are looking at the uncomfortable truth that our species may have survived not by replacing every other human, but by carrying pieces of them forward inside ourselves. Number 7. Chauvet Cave, the Child and the Wolf in the Dark. In December 1994, 3 cave explorers squeezed through a narrow opening in the cliffs of southern France and entered a chamber sealed away from the world for thousands of years. What they found inside Chauvet Cave changed the story of prehistoric art. The walls were covered with horses, lions, rhinoceroses, mammoths, bears, and other Ice Age animals, drawn with a level of skill that seemed impossible for their age. The figures moved across the stone with shading, motion, and confidence, as if the people who painted them had mastered visual storytelling before civilization had begun. But deep inside the cave, beyond the paintings, another discovery waited in the clay. It was far more disturbing, the footprints of a child walking into the dark. The child was young, perhaps around 8 to 10 years old, and the tracks show careful movement through the cave floor. This was not a casual step near the entrance where daylight still reached. The child walked deep underground, hundreds of meters from the outside world, carrying a torch. Charcoal traces suggest that the torch was rubbed against the cave wall as the flame burned down, leaving marks from a journey no modern person can fully explain. Imagine that moment, a child in absolute darkness, surrounded by painted predators, moving through chambers where one wrong turn could mean panic, injury, or death. The cave was not a playground. It was a sacred, dangerous, living darkness. But the child was not the only one leaving tracks. Beside the human footprints were the prints of a large canid, often interpreted as a wolf or an early dog-like animal. The 2 sets of tracks move in the same direction for a stretch of the cave, close enough to suggest that the child and the animal shared the space at the same time. That is where the mystery becomes almost unbearable. Were they companions? Was this an early sign of the bond between humans and dogs, older than many timelines allow? Or was the animal a wild wolf, following the child through the dark, its steps preserved beside the smaller human prints like a silent threat? The clay gives us movement, but not the relationship. Every explanation changes the emotional meaning of the scene. If the animal was a companion, then Chauvet may preserve one of the earliest glimpses of human-animal partnership, a child and a canid entering the deep cave together, while adults painted the great beasts of the Ice Age. If it was a wolf, then the prints may record something far more frightening, a child being tracked in a place where escape would have been difficult, and the darkness belonged to predators as much as people. A third possibility is stranger still. The cave may have been a ritual space, and the animal tracks may relate to ceremonies, masks, controlled encounters, or symbolic journeys we no longer know how to read. In that case, the child was not merely exploring. The child may have been part of something. Chauvet itself makes the scene feel even less ordinary. The cave was filled with images of powerful animals, cave lions, bears, rhinos, mammoths. These were not just food animals painted for decoration. They were beings of fear, force, and spiritual weight. To walk through those chambers by torchlight would have been to move among living shadows. Adows. The paintings would flicker as the flame shifted. Eyes would appear and disappear. Horns, claws, and bodies would emerge from the stone, then vanish again into darkness. A child walking there with a wolf-like animal beside him does not feel like an accident. It feels like a moment from a belief system that has lost its language. The most haunting part is that the footprints end where the soft clay gives way to harder ground. We do not know whether the child turned back, continued deeper, met others, or left safely. We do not know whether the animal remained beside him, followed him, or disappeared into another passage. There is no body, no final scene, no explanation. Only the path remains. The cave preserved a few steps from a life that vanished 36,000 years ago, and then refused to give us the ending. It gives just enough to imagine, and too little to know. But that is why Chauvet Cave belongs among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. The paintings reveal genius, but the footprints reveal something more intimate and more frightening. A child, a flame, a wolf-like presence, and the deep darkness of Ice Age Europe. Whether the tracks record companionship, danger, ritual, or something beyond our categories, they show that prehistoric caves were not passive shelters. They were places where humans entered the earth and did things powerful enough to leave traces for tens of thousands of years. Somewhere in Chauvet, a child walked forward with light in his hand, and the cave remembered every step. Number 6. Dolní Věstonice, the triple burial no one can explain. In the frozen world of Ice Age Europe, near the foothills of what is now the Czech Republic, archaeologists uncovered a grave that still refuses to become understandable. The site is Dolní Věstonice, already famous for mammoth bones, carved ivory, fired clay figurines, and evidence of people who lived in a harsh landscape more than 30,000 years ago. But one burial stood apart from everything else. In a shallow grave lay 3 young people, arranged together with a level of care and strangeness that turned the discovery into one of the most disturbing scenes from the Upper Paleolithic. They were not elderly, they were not children, they were young adults placed in a configuration that looks deliberate, symbolic, and almost impossible to explain. The central figure was a young woman whose body showed signs of serious physical difference. Her skeleton suggests spinal deformity, uneven development, and conditions that may have caused pain or limited movement during life. In a world of hunters, gatherers, long winters, heavy labor, and constant danger, such differences would have been impossible for her community to ignore. She would have needed care, patience, and protection. Yet her burial does not suggest rejection. It suggests importance. She was placed at the center of the grave, as if the entire arrangement revolved around her. On either side of her lay 2 young men, positioned in ways that seemed too specific to be accidental. One of the males was buried face down, his head turned toward the woman. The other lay on his back, with his hand placed near her pelvis in a gesture that has troubled researchers for decades. Whether placement feels intimate, ritual, symbolic, or possibly disturbing, but no single interpretation can hold it completely. Was it connected to fertility, death, healing, status, punishment, sacrifice, or a story known only to the people who buried them? We do not know. What we do know is that the bodies were not casually thrown into the ground. Someone arranged them, someone decided where their heads, arms, and hands would rest. Someone made the grave into a message, and then time erased the language needed to read it. Red ochre covered parts of the burial, turning the grave into a scene of color, death, and ritual. In Ice Age burials, ochre often appears as a powerful material, linked perhaps to blood, rebirth, transformation, or the marking of the dead for a journey beyond ordinary life. Here, its presence makes the triple burial feel even more aged. These young people were not simply hidden away. They were transformed before being sealed into the earth. Grave goods, ornaments, and animal materials nearby suggest that the community invested effort into the burial. In a world where every hour of labor mattered, that effort means the deaths mattered. The greatest mystery is how they died. Some evidence suggests trauma, including injury to one of the males, but the full story remains uncertain. Were they killed in violence? Did they die in the same event? Were one or more of them sacrificed? Was the burial meant to bind them together after death, or to control something feared about them in life? The central woman's physical condition has led some to suggest that she may have held a special role, perhaps as a ritual figure, healer, outsider or person seen as touched by forces beyond ordinary life. But that is only a possibility. Her community may have seen her with reverence, fear, love, pity, or a meaning we cannot reconstruct. What makes Dolní Věstonice so unsettling is not only the death of 3 young people, but the feeling that we are looking at a ritual without the key. Everything appears intentional, yet nothing explains itself. The bodies form a composition. The ochre marks them. The gestures seem meaningful. The grave goods add weight. But the people who understood the scene vanished tens of thousands of years before writing, before cities, before any record could preserve their belief system. We are left staring at a frozen sentence from a language that no longer exists. That is why Dolní Věstonice belongs among the prehistoric cave and burial discoveries that should have stayed buried. It gives us no clean answer, only the disturbing certainty that Ice Age people were capable of symbolic acts as deep and strange as any later civilization. They cared for the different, arranged the dead, used color, gesture, and body position to say something powerful, and then left that message where only the future would find it. 3 young people lay together for more than 30,000 years, 1 at the center, 2 beside her, their final arrangement still speaking without words. And the most haunting part is that the grave may be telling us exactly what happened, but we no longer know how to listen. Number 5, Shanidar Cave, the Neanderthal dead, who returned to the same place. In the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, Shanidar Cave opened a door into a side of Neanderthal life that early science was not ready to accept. When archaeologists excavated there in the 20th century, they found the remains of multiple Neanderthals buried in the cave's deposits, some dating back tens of thousands of years. At first, the most famous discovery seemed almost beautiful, a body surrounded by pollen, interpreted as evidence that Neanderthals had placed flowers with their dead. For decades, that idea transformed the public image of our extinct cousins. They were no longer imagined only as brutal survivors of the Ice Age. They became beings capable of grief, ceremony, and tenderness. But the deeper researchers looked into Shanidar, the less simple the story became. The flower burial itself became controversial. Later analysis suggested that some of the pollen may have been brought into the cave by burrowing animals, rather than placed by Neanderthal hands. What once looked like clear evidence of ritual sympathy became harder to prove. But that did not make Shanidar less important. In some ways, it made the cave more disturbing, because the strongest evidence was not a single cluster of pollen. It was the repeated return of Neanderthal dead to the same place across long spans of time. Shanidar was not merely a cave where bones accidentally accumulated. It appears to have been a location that Neanderthals came back to, generation after generation, carrying their dead into a space that held meaning long before Homo sapiens wrote anything down. That repeated use changes everything. To return to the same burial place, a group must remember, bear. They must teach the location, preserve the path, and understand that certain bodies belong in certain spaces. This is not the behavior of creatures living only in the present. It suggests memory carried through community. It suggests that death had geography. A body was not simply left where it fell. It could be moved, placed, and joined to earlier dead in a chamber that became part of the group's identity. Even if flowers were not intentionally laid around the body, Shanidar still shows something powerful. Neanderthals treated some places as different from other places, and some deaths as events that required return. The cave also held evidence of injury, survival, and care. One of the Shanidar individuals lived with severe physical damage, including injuries that would have made daily life difficult. He survived for years after wounds that might have killed someone left alone. That survival implies help from others. Food shared, protection given, movement accommodated, and patience extended across time. In the same cave that held the dead, we also see evidence that the living did not always abandon the weak. Shanidar shows Neanderthals as social beings caught between harsh survival and deep care, capable of violence elsewhere, but also capable of keeping injured individuals alive. The most haunting discoveries came when later excavations returned to the site and found new remains still resting in the cave. One individual appeared carefully positioned, the body folded and placed in a way that again suggested deliberate deposition rather than accident. Nearby, rockfall and cave processes complicated the interpretation, reminding researchers that caves are never passive containers. They crush, shift, bury, expose, and confuse the dead. Shanidar is not a clean graveyard. It is a living geological space where bodies, stones, animals, water, and time have all interfered with one another. That makes every interpretation dangerous, but also makes the cave feel more real. The dead were not placed into a museum drawer. They were given to the earth, and the earth kept changing around them. That is why Shanidar Cave belongs among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. It does not give us a simple answer about Neanderthal religion, but it gives us something more unsettling. Evidence that our extinct cousins may have remembered death across generations. They returned to the same chamber, placed bodies there, cared for the injured in life, and left remains that still resist easy explanation. The famous flowers may be uncertain, but the cave's deeper message is not. The Neanderthals were not shadows at the edge of humanity. They were people of their own kind, with memory, bonds, suffering, and places that mattered. Shanidar did not simply preserve bones. It preserved the possibility that long before our species dominated the world, another humanity was already carrying its dead into the dark. Number 4. Gough's Cave, the Skull Cups of Britain. In the limestone cliffs of Cheddar Gorge in England, Gough's Cave looks at first like the kind of place where prehistory should feel distant and museum-safe. Tourists can walk through the chambers today, surrounded by stone, shadow, and carefully lit passages. But beneath that modern surface, the cave once held evidence of one of the most disturbing practices ever found in prehistoric Britain. Human bones recovered from deeper layers revealed that people had not merely died there. They had been cut apart, broken open, eaten, and transformed into objects. The cave preserved a scene from nearly 15,000 years ago, when the line between the dead, the meal, and the tool became almost impossible to separate. The bones belonged to several individuals, including adults and children. The cut marks on the remains showed the same careful butchery patterns used on animal carcasses from the same period. Flesh had been removed with stone tools. Long bones had been cracked open to reach marrow. Skulls had been processed with particular attention. The lower jaws were removed, the facial bones were broken away, and the upper portions of the skulls were shaped into bowls. Their edges were trimmed and smoothed with care. These were not random fragments left by violence or decay. They were skull cups, made from human heads by people who knew exactly what they were doing. What makes Gough's Cave so disturbing is that the people who made these objects were not starving in an obvious wasteland. The cave deposits included remains of animals such as horse, deer, and other game, suggesting that food was available. That cannibalism does not look like a desperate final act by people with no alternatives. It looks organized, repeated, and deliberate. That forces the darker question. Were the bodies consumed as part of a mortuary ritual, an act of reverence, an expression of dominance over enemies, or simply because human flesh had become one more resource in their world? Every answer is unsettling, because each one means the behavior had meaning. The skull cups carry the horror further than the cut marks. Eating the dead might be explained as hunger, ritual, or violence, but turning skulls into vessels required time and intention after the bodies had already been processed. Someone held the skull of a dead person and shaped it into an object that could be used again. The smoothing of the rims suggests care, perhaps even craftsmanship. These were not trophies thrown aside in panic. They were made, and they may have been used. And if they were used repeatedly, then the dead remained present in the lives of the living, not as memories alone, but as objects held in the hand and raised to the mouth. The presence of a child among the remains makes the discovery almost unbearable. A child's skull cup is small, intimate, and impossible to reduce to an archaeological category, without feeling the human weight of it. Whoever made it had crossed a boundary that modern people find nearly impossible to imagine. Was the child a member of their own group, consumed after death as part of a funerary rite? Was the child from an enemy community turned into an object of victory or humiliation? Or did the people of Gough's cave understand the body in a way so different from ours that the skull was not a violation but a continuation of the person's place among the living? We cannot know, and that uncertainty is part of the horror. Gough's cave forces us to confront a version of prehistory that is neither noble nor simple. The people who lived there were not mindless savages, but they were also not harmless ancestors softened by distance. They were skilled, symbolic, practical, and capable of acts that make the modern imagination recoil. They could hunt animals, shape tools, occupy caves, and perhaps carry complex beliefs about death and transformation. And they could also process human bodies with the same precision they used on prey. Their world was not less human than ours. It was human in a way we do not want to recognize. That is why Gough's cave belongs among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. It did not preserve a beautiful painting, a peaceful burial, or a lost tool alone. It preserved evidence that people once ate human bodies and made drinking vessels from human skulls, including the skull of a child. The cave turns death into something practical, ritual, and terrifying all at once. Its chambers remind us that the deep past was not clean. It held grief, hunger, belief, violence, and customs that may never fit comfortably inside modern morality. In the darkness of Gough's cave, the dead were not only remembered, they were consumed, reshaped, and carried forward in the hands of the living. Number 3. Bruniquel Cave, the Neanderthal rings in total darkness. Deep inside a cave in southwestern France, far beyond the reach of daylight, someone built rings from broken stone more than 176,000 years ago. The place is Bruniquel Cave, and its discovery changed what researchers believed Neanderthals were capable of. The structures lie more than 300 meters from the entrance, in a chamber so deep that no natural light could ever reach it. To get there, the builders had to enter blackness with fire, move through passages where a lost flame could mean death, and know the cave well enough to return to the same hidden space more than once. This was not shelter. This was not a place to sleep, cook, or hide from weather. It was something built in the dark for a reason that disappeared with its makers. The structures were made from hundreds of broken stalagmite pieces snapped from the cave floor and arranged into circular forms. Some pieces were stacked, others were placed in lines or piles. The total weight of the material was enormous for people working with stone tools, firelight, and human hands alone. This required planning, coordination, and shared intention. Someone had to decide which stalagmites to break, where to place them, how to arrange the rings, and what the finished structure was meant to become. The builders were not wandering accidentally through the cave. They were shaping the underground world, turning a natural chamber into a constructed space. What makes Bruniquel so disturbing is its age. These rings were not made by modern humans painting animals on cave walls during the later Ice Age. They were made long before Homo sapiens became established in Europe, but the builders were Neanderthals. For a long time, older views treated Neanderthals as practical survivors, strong, intelligent in a limited way, capable of tools and fire, but not necessarily capable of symbolic architecture or deep ritual planning. Bruniquel forces that picture to break. The people who built these rings had to cooperate in darkness, maintain fire, organize labor, and return to a chamber with no obvious survival value. They were doing something beyond immediate need. The evidence of fire makes the scene even stranger. Some of the stalagmite pieces show traces of burning, suggesting that fire was used inside or near the structures. But the chamber does not look like a domestic living space. There are no clear signs of ordinary habitation, no meals scattered across the floor, no pile of tools showing daily activity. But the fire seems tied to the rings themselves, as if light, heat, smoke, or flame formed part of the purpose. In that deep chamber, Neanderthals may have gathered around fire-lit circles of broken stone, their shadows moving across walls that no sun had touched. We can describe the physics of the scene, but not its meaning. Every possible explanation feels incomplete. Maybe the rings were ritual structures. Maybe they marked a gathering place, a boundary, a test, a ceremony, or a space connected to stories about the underground world. Maybe they served a practical purpose we cannot recognize because no similar structure survives elsewhere. Or maybe their function belonged to a Neanderthal way of thinking that modern humans are too late to understand. The worst part is not that we lack an answer. It is that the answer once existed. The builders knew why they went there. They knew why the stones had to be broken and placed. They knew what the darkness meant. That knowledge died with them. Bruniquel also makes every unexplored cave feel different. If Neanderthals built one structure this deep, how many others may still exist in chambers we have not entered? How many stone arrangements, burned spaces, hidden deposits, or symbolic acts have been sealed away by fallen rock and sediment? The prehistoric world beneath Europe may contain a second archive, not of paintings and bones alone, but of actions performed in darkness by people whose minds were more complex than we allowed them to be. Bruniquel is not frightening because it proves Neanderthals were exactly like us. It is frightening because it proves they were doing things we still cannot explain. That is why Bruniquel Cave belongs among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. It is not a grave, not a cannibal site, and not a painting of animals charging across stone. It is something quieter and more unnerving, a deliberate construction deep underground, made by extinct humans long before our species owned the continent. More than 176,000 years ago, Neanderthals carried fire into the earth, broke stalagmites from the cave floor, arranged them into rings, and left them in darkness. The cave kept their secret for longer than every civilization in history combined. And when we finally found it, the stones were still there, asking a question no living human can answer. What were they doing so far from the light? Number 2. Rising Star Cave, the Homo naledi burial chamber. In South Africa, inside the Rising Star Cave system, a narrow passage led to a chamber that challenged one of the deepest assumptions about human origins. The chamber is known as naledi. The route involves darkness, tight spaces, and passages so narrow that trained cavers had to squeeze through with extreme care. Yet inside it, the floor held an extraordinary concentration of bones from a previously unknown human relative, later named Homo naledi. The species seemed almost impossible, small-brained, ancient in some traits, modern in others, and living when Homo sapiens may already have existed in Africa. But the bones themselves were only the beginning of the mystery. The first question was how they got there. The naledi chamber is not an easy place for bodies to arrive by accident. It is deep inside the cave, separated from the outside world by difficult passages. There is no clear evidence that predators dragged the bodies in. There is no simple flood route that explains why so many individuals ended up in the same chamber. The remains include adults, children, and infants, suggesting repeated deposition over time rather than one sudden disaster. That pattern forces a disturbing possibility. Homo naledi may have carried its dead into the darkness deliberately. If that interpretation is correct, then Rising Star becomes one of the most unsettling cave discoveries in prehistory. For decades, researchers linked complex behavior with large brains. Burial, ritual, symbolism, and deliberate treatment of the dead were treated as the territory of Homo sapiens, and, to some extent, Neanderthals. A Homo naledi had a brain much smaller than ours, closer in size to earlier human relatives. By old assumptions, it should not have been capable of anything like a mortuary tradition. Yet the cave seems to suggest deliberate disposal of the dead in a special place. The chamber does not care what our theories expected. The bones are still there. The journey into naledi would have required more than casual movement. A body had to be moved through narrow darkness, through dangerous passages where balance, memory, and light mattered. If Homo naledi carried the dead there, then they had to know the route and return to it. They had to understand that this chamber was different from other spaces. Even if they did not think about death as we do, they may have had a repeated behavior surrounding dead bodies, a tradition passed from one generation to another. That idea is uncomfortable because it means the roots of mortuary behavior may reach beyond the kind of mind we recognize as human. The cave also raises the question of fire and darkness. How did Homo naledi move through those passages? Did they use light? Did they memorize the path? Did they enter in groups, guiding one another through the stone? The chamber is not meaningful because it is beautiful or easy. It is meaningful, if it was meaningful at all, because it is hard to reach. To place the dead in a hidden chamber deep underground is to separate them from ordinary life. It creates a boundary between the living world and the dark interior of the earth. Whether Homo naledi understood that boundary spiritually, socially, or practically, the result feels hauntingly familiar. But in recent years, the rising star discoveries have become even more controversial, with claims of possible markings on cave walls and evidence that might suggest fire use or symbolic activity. Not all researchers agree, and the debate remains fierce. But even without accepting every claim, the central problem does not disappear. A small-brained human relative left many of its dead in one of the most inaccessible chambers of a dangerous cave system. That fact alone is enough to disturb the old hierarchy of intelligence. Maybe large brains were not the only path to meaning. Maybe grief, memory, or ritual began in forms we are not prepared to recognize. That is why Rising Star Cave belongs among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. It does not give us a clean story of modern humans inventing death rituals alone. It gives us another possibility, that a different human relative, one with a small brain and a body unlike ours, was entering the deep earth again and again with its dead. The naledi chamber is not terrifying because it contains bones. Many caves contain bones. It is terrifying because those bones may represent intention from a mind we thought was too small for such things. Somewhere in the darkness beneath South Africa, Homo naledi left its dead in a place the living had to choose. And if they chose it, then the cave is not just a fossil site. It is a question about what humanity was before we became the only ones left to answer. Number 1. Altamura Man, the Neanderthal trapped in stone. In southern Italy, beneath the limestone plateau of Altamura, a cave holds one of the most disturbing human remains ever found. In 1993, cavers entered a cast chamber and saw a skeleton embedded in the rock itself, fused into the cave wall by mineral deposits that had grown over it for thousands upon thousands of years. The skull was tilted upward, the jaw was open, the bones were not lying loose on the floor, waiting to be lifted and studied. They had become part of the cave. Calcium carbonate had covered the body in pale formations, locking the skeleton into stone so completely that removing it would destroy the very thing that makes it priceless. The dead man could not be taken out. He could only be visited where he died. But the skeleton belonged to a Neanderthal, now known as Altamura Man, who lived more than 100,000 years ago. His remains are among the most complete Neanderthal skeletons ever discovered, but they are also among the most inaccessible. Most ancient bones are excavated, cleaned, measured, placed in collections, and turned into objects of study. Altamura Man resists that process. He is still in the chamber, still held by the cave, still positioned in the place where his final moments became geological memory. He is not displayed like a fossil behind glass. He remains underground, his bones fused to the world that killed and preserved him. The story of his death is what makes the discovery so haunting. He likely fell into the cave through a vertical shaft or hid an opening above, dropping into a chamber from which there was no easy escape. The fall may not have killed him, but that is the horror. He may have survived the impact, injured, confused, and trapped in darkness. The walls around him offered no path back to the surface. The passages led deeper into stone, not upward toward air and daylight. He would have searched. He would have moved through the chamber, testing rock, listening for wind, looking for the faintest sign of an opening. But the cave did not give him a way out. If he survived for days, then his final experience was not sudden death, but understanding. Hunger would have come first, then thirst, weakness, panic, exhaustion, and silence. He may have called out, but no one above heard him. He may have seen light from the opening, unreachable and shrinking with each failed attempt to climb. He may have known that the world was still there above him. The sky, the land, his group, the paths he had walked, animals moving across the plateau. But the cave had separated him from all of it. His final position, with his face turned upward, makes the scene almost unbearable. It looks as if he died looking toward the place he could not reach. After death, the cave began its slow work. Water dripped through limestone, carrying minerals that settled over bone. Year after year, layer after layer, the skeleton was coated, sealed, and transformed. The mouth remained open, the skull remained tilted. The body did not vanish into dust. It became part of the chamber, covered in calcite like frozen foam. Time did not erase him. It trapped him more completely. The same cave that denied him escape became the reason he survived for modern eyes to find. In the open air, his bones might have scattered or decayed. Underground, the cave kept him exactly where death left him. What makes Altamura Man different from many prehistoric discoveries is the intimacy of his suffering. He was not buried by others, not arranged in ritual, not consumed, not placed with offerings. He was alone. There is no symbolic system to interpret, no grave goods to soften the scene, no community gesture to suggest care after death. There is only a person trapped underground and preserved in the posture of his final failure. The discovery strips prehistory down to something painfully simple. A living being fell into darkness, could not escape, and died facing the light. That is why Altamura Man belongs at number 1 among the prehistoric cave discoveries that should have stayed buried. His cave does not preserve a mystery of art, ritual, or migration. It preserves a final moment. A Neanderthal who walked the earth before our recorded world existed, fell through stone, survived long enough to know he was trapped, and became part of the cave that killed him. More than 100,000 years later, he is still there, mouth open, face lifted, bones sealed into mineral memory. The cave has not forgotten him. It never let him go. And somewhere beneath southern Italy, in a chamber most people will never enter, Altamura Man is still looking up.